Hey guys, welcome to the first Fjordhammer book review. This is a new thing for me, as the entire rest of the podcast is, so please bear with me. I've not decided on the book review format yet, but I am trying out some things and I wanted it to be a little bit different from how other podcasts may do it. Especially, I wanted it to be short, sweet, and informative. Preferably, I'd like to do my reviews without spoilers as far as possible, just so that the experience of the reading the books themselves is left to you, the listeners, so that you guys go into the book as unspoiled as possible, but still with an idea of whether this book is worth reading or not. And as such, I'm not going to do like some other podcasters do and like follow the entire story. They're very good at that, but that's not the format that I would like to do. Instead, I want to focus on whether or not it was an enjoyable read, how the characters work, how the book works within the setting and uses the setting. Again, the most important part, whether or not it's an enjoyable read. So, without any further ado, let's get into the review. From the maelstrom of a sundered world, the 8 realms were born. Formless and the divine exploded into life. Strange new worlds appeared in the firmament, each one gilded with spirits, gods, and men. Noblest of the gods was Sigmar. For years beyond reckoning, he illuminated the realms, wreathed in light and majesty as he carved out his reign. His strength was the power of thunder. His wisdom was infinite. Mortal and immortal alike kneeled before his lofty throne. Great empires rose, and for a while treachery was banished. Sigmar claimed the land and sky as his own and ruled over a glorious age of myth. But cruelty is tenacious. As had been foreseen, the great alliance of gods and men tore itself apart. Myth and legend crumbled into chaos. Darkness flooded the realms. Torture, slavery, and fear replaced the glory that came before. Sigmar turned his back on the mortal realms, disgusted by their fate. He fixed his gaze instead on the remains of the world he had lost long ago, brooding over its charred core, searching endlessly for a sign of hope. And then, in the dark heat of his rage, he caught a glimpse of something magnificent. He pictured a weapon born of the heavens, a beacon powerful enough to pierce the endless night, an army hewed from everything he had lost. Sigmar set his artisans to work, and for a long time they toiled, striving to harness the power of the stars. As Sigmar's great work neared completion, he turned back to the realms and saw that the dominion of chaos was almost complete. The hour for vengeance had come. Finally, with lightning blazing across his brow, he stepped forth to unleash his creations. The Age of Sigmar had begun. And that's how the Gates of Azyr starts. Now, the Gates of Azyr is the first Age of Sigmar book that ever came out, well, first Age of Sigmar novel. It's written by Chris Ray, came out alongside the Age of Sigmar starter set in July 2015. It covers the opening moments of the Age of Sigmar setting itself, and is a short form novella rather than a full novel. Now, the reason I wanted to cover this book is, well, multifold. I wanted to cover it because it's the first book in the Age of Sigmar Realmgate Wars series. It's the first book at all that came out, and I remember quite well when it came out. I was on vacation. The Age of Sigmar dropped out of nowhere, and the only information that you could get outside of blurry pictures of people picking up their starter sets was this book, and it serves as a sort of introduction to the setting, and it continues to serve in that role. It covers the still very relevant starter set. It covers the Stormcast Eternals themselves, and I feel it does that quite well. It's really short, easy to read, and it's cheaper than the other books. So if you just want to read something of Age of Sigmar, it's probably the best place to start. So I wanted to review this book in part because of its role in the series and in the setting itself, rather than, on the basis of, is it the most enjoyable book? No, I don't think so. Is it most important book in the series? Maybe. Very might well be. And I think no matter what sort of fan of Age of Sigmar you are, or even if you're not a fan and just want to sort of get an intro to it, I think starting with Gates of Azyr is a good place to start. So, what's this book about? It starts, as you sort of heard with the read up there, at the very start of the Age of Sigmar setting itself. It covers the actual opening moment of Age of Sigmar. The moment where the setting goes from darkness and disaster and unrelenting retreats to the return of the gods, to the return of Sigmar, and to the entry of the Stormcast Eternals themselves into the setting. So the main character hook is undoubtedly Vandus Hammerhand, the Lord Celestant of the Hammerhand warrior host of the Hammers of Sigmar. There's a surprising amount of bureaucracy in this Eternals. It follows him. It follows Corios Cool, the mighty Lord of Khorne. Follows the other named characters from the starter set that you might know, the Whip guy, the Banner guy, and Ionis Cryptborn, the Lord Relictor. And thankfully, it covers a couple of minor characters from the book. The opening moments of the book is Vandus and his Hammerhands' assault on the gates of Azyr. It's the moment that starts the Age of Sigmar itself. And it goes into quite a bit of detail about that, about how Vandus is the first to go from Azyr, the realm of the heavens, back into the realm of mortals, the other realms. The first time in hundreds of years any one of these people have seen the other mortal realm and seen what chaos has done. So it follows them, and it follows this battle about how this first gate opens and what the events there lead to. I'm a bit new to doing book reviews. Obviously, this is my first podcast, and the format's going to go a bit back and forth until I establish the way that I want to do these things. Does it capture the imagination? Does this book, this novella, capture the imagination? And in a lot of ways, I think it does. It opens, as you guys heard, with I'm not even sure what it's called, but the sort of intro that's in every single story book for the Age of Sigmar, which is a nice little written thing. And then it goes into a speech by Vandus Hammerhand, sort of how his start, a bit about him, and then the moment before the Stormcast Eternals are shot down to the realm of fire. And in that moment, it's a very movie moment how Vandus is standing in front of a legion of soldiers and just having an excellent speech. It's really, really enjoyable. And it has a lot of small details that fills it out without slowing it down at all. It's very, very interesting. I was hyped myself by the end of reading it. It's just like you felt the energy in the story. And I thought that was a great start. It continues by following probably the two most interesting characters in the book, which is a mortal running from a group of blood reavers and a blood reaver chasing the same mortals. And they just give an excellent introduction to what the mortal realms are like for mortals. There's a lot of comments about how the mortal realms and what Age of Sigmar is about these immortals. How the hordes of chaos are endless, and the Stormcast Eternals themselves are immortal. But this book doesn't forget about regular humans. Doesn't forget that even the Blood Reavers used to be, tribesmen, hunters, soldiers, regular people who've become corrupted by the influence of chaos. And for me, that really captured my attention and my imagination. How the book describes both the person being hunted, how it feels to live in a world that's been under the reign of chaos for hundreds of years, but also how being a follower of chaos isn't just about killing and eating and worshipping evil. It's not the way you expect it to work. Oh, I'm gonna follow chaos and become a Khorne follower, siege warrior. It's It's a very understandable path that they get on. And then it corrupts them, even without themselves understanding how. I think that part, the character part of these two mortal characters, of Vandus himself and of Ionis Cryptborn, really sort of drew me in and was very, very interesting. The setting for the book itself is a bit not interesting. It's like plains of lava. It lacks the imagination and the spectacle of later books. If you can imagine just a plain of ash and lava, that's literally all there is to it. The area that they're in is frankly a bit boring. Interesting to read about. It suffers a bit from that, and it suffers a bit from being a very short story with a very long series of battles. Like, even by the end of this, I was a bit tired of the blood, fighting aspect of the story. It's just, for a book of barely 100 pages, has more fighting and more blood for the blood god than it can really serve. And the combat's it's less interesting than it necessarily needs to be. It feels a bit like the writer, Mr. Wright, was tied up by having to write specifically about what's in the starter set, that he couldn't go out beyond that. Speculation on my part, so that may not be entirely fair to anyone involved in the project. But the constraint of being the tie-in novel, so to speak, to the starter set is a bit obvious in that all the heroes have to fight all the other heroes, and Vandus has to win, and Corgus has to fight him, and they have some sort of destined fate together, which is on one hand a bit interesting, and on the other hand, a bit contrived. I feel like the book captures me more in its characters than it does in its setting or in its battles. It sort of leads me over to the next point that I feel is important in any book, which is obviously the characters. No good reading a book with interesting characters. And Gates of Azyr strikes in a reasonable balance here. I think obviously the main characters, to sort of repeat it, is Vandus, Hammerhand, the Lord Celestin on Dracoth, Ionis Cryptborn, the other Stormcast Eternal hero, who's a Lord Relictor, Korg's Cool, which is the bloodbound, the mighty Lord of Khorne, Thrax Skullbrand, which is the Blood Secretor, the guy wielding the giant banner, the Whip guy, who's really just not there, and a couple of minor characters. And honestly, I think Vandus is a more interesting character than he's often given credit for. As sort of the poster boy of the Stormcast Eternals, he's gotten a lot of flack for being all the negative traits that people draw with the Stormcast Eternals, but he doesn't actually suffer from that when you read this book. He knows that he's the Lord, he knows that he's immortal, but he doesn't know what that actually means. And while he doesn't doubt his purpose, he does doubt himself. He's not sure. He doesn't like arrive and is 100% sure on every setting that he can do everything demanded of him. That's just not how he works and what he does. And that makes him a lot more interesting than he often appears. And he has, without spoiling too much, it's obvious that he's also the archetype for the Stormcast Eternal trope of ending up in the situation close to wherever they died originally. And here it sort of works and sort of doesn't. I found it a bit contrived that Korgus Cool hundreds of years ago killed the last living tribe of humans in this area, and that the leader of that tribe just happens to be Vandus. Obviously, you could say that, oh, maybe this is Sigmar's plan, but it works to create a rivalry between Korgus Cool and Vandus Hammerhand, but it doesn't feel like it exists for narrative purposes, rather for creating that rivalry between Vandus and Korgus, to create a more interesting setting outside the book itself rather than within the book, which I think is a bit of a shame, and I'm not entirely sure what they could have done differently there. As for Ionis Cryptborn, he doesn't get a lot of time, but he's definitely one of the more mysterious characters. For those of you who don't know the Lord Relictor's sort of role, well, while it's never really established in the books, more about the spiritual side of the Stormcast Eternals, and Ionis has some sort of mysterious connection to some other power than Sigmar. Our first sort of glimpse into him is him almost scoffing at the other Stormcast pomp and thunder, fondness for their own iconography. He owes a duty to Sigmar, and he's going to fulfill that, but he's not a believer in the way that maybe Vandus is, and maybe the rank Liberator and Judicator is. He has a duty, and that's what he's there for. The thing that really makes him interesting is not just that, but he also has some sort of obligation to another power, something other than Sigmar. And we don't get to know what it is, but obviously it's got a connection to the undead, and therefore probably it's Nagash. But there's like a continual theme of a soul for a soul, and a tithe is owed, and it's all very mysterious. And it makes him a lot more interesting than his sort of appearance and actions are, because all he really does is arrive and fight a bit, have a boring conversation with Vandus. So his actions are a bit boring, but the mystery around him is fascinating. Corgus, I think, the main bad guy, suffers from being a follower of the Blood God. He's not very interesting at all. He aims for demonhood, and he can achieve it, but it's a bit like blood for the Blood God, fight, fight, fight. Don't know what's going on, but I know a little bit more than these other regular guys around him. So honestly, none of the Bloodbound characters are very. I'm not gonna spend any more time on them, except for the Blood Reaver. As I mentioned, one of the highlights for this book for me was the first-person view from the Blood Reaver, and how the Blood Reaver like clan structure works, and how he ended up in that situation. I just thought that was really, really interesting. They're not just, he became a Blood Raver not because he believed or because he wanted to kill or anything like that, but because he was a coward. Because he would rather kill and eat his own friends than be killed and eaten, which is, I guess, in some odd way an understandable motive, unfortunately, maybe. All in all, I just thought that was very, very interesting. And the last sort of character worth mentioning is the Mortal. She's, as a character, she's not very interesting, but as a viewpoint into the Mortals, she is. So honestly, most of the characters in the book were interesting to read about, but some of them were a lot better than the others, especially Ionis internally, Vandus in general, and the Blood Reaver guy until he gets splattered. I guess that's a spoiler, so I shouldn't say that. So how's this book written? Well, I think it's written quite well. It's a short story, but it flows well. It's easy to read. There's some very nice imagery. As I mentioned, I don't think it's the most, like, the setting itself. It's not as interesting as it could be, but I don't think that's a flaw of Rafe's writing, because I just really liked reading this book. It not leaps off the page. It just sort of goes down like a good drink. It's just an enjoyable read. My only issue, as I already mentioned, is the amount of fighting, which is the amount of fighting for fighting's sake. Because of the somewhat uninteresting combination of troops and characters, the fighting itself is a bit uninteresting. There's some good fights. The fight between Corgus and Vandus is very good, and some of the minor skirmishes, like the first prosecutor fight, is a lot more interesting than I thought it would be. But the sheer amount of it in such a small book is a bit limiting, I'm afraid. And it gets a bit tiresome when thematically the book reads the same almost the entire way through. And I guess that's on purpose, but it's a very conflict-filled book from the first chapter, of which is like an epic, awesome battle speech. It's almost non-stop action. If that's your sort of thing, this book's pretty good. But for me, I thought it was a bit much. It could have benefited from a bit more time spent with the characters, or with the area, or with the setting itself. If you want to read a lot of books, this is pretty important. It's important to me because I like to read my settings and my stories, catch as many details, and find them as established as possible. I like it when the settings I read about are coherent and every book either flows into the other or benefits the other books in some way. And Gates of Azyr is pretty much, well, obviously, as the first book in the setting, it sets up a lot of things. It sets up the realm of fire. It sets up this rivalry between Corgus and Vandus play out in the next few books. It sets up Stormcast Eternals and their relationship with their own immortality. It sets up other characters like Ionis. I think if you're interested in the Age of Sigmar, you want to read the book just to have read it, just to have been in the story and seen these early moments. Beyond that, I think it's obvious that it's limited by its position as the very first book. I think anyone who's been a part of Age of Sigmar since the start has noticed how the setting has developed massively over the last year and a half. That it's grown and filled itself in quite a bit. And this book doesn't benefit from all of that. It doesn't benefit from the additional narrative and additional backstory and additional breadth of setting, and it's doing its magic with a very limited set of tools. And I think it does so well, but it's obvious that had the same book been written today, it would have been quite different in many ways. But as I mentioned at the start, the most important part about books like these is whether or not they're fun. I read a lot of books for a lot of different reasons, but I feel that the thing most people are interested in from their Warhammer books, entertainment, and probably in that sense light entertainment. Now, there's people out there who read Shakespeare for fun, who read the Odyssey for fun, or read the Iliad, or a whole host of other books that are complex and difficult, may require 2 or 3 readings. I know a lot of people who think Game of Thrones, million book selling series, isn't very fun to read just because it's very complex. It's got a lot of moving pieces. This book doesn't have that. It's got a very clear cast, clear good versus bad, short. You could bring this and you can read it on like 2, 3 trips on the bus. In your lunch break, you could probably read most of it, depending on your reading speed, and you'd be entertained the entire way. I don't think you'd be bored reading this book. I think you'd enjoy reading it. It's not long enough that you get really tired with any part of it, but it's not so short that you feel like there was nothing there. I would have liked it to be longer. That's not always an option. My only complaint, which I've mentioned a few times, is that I feel the battle scenes, for the length of this book, they're a bit much. But if you don't mind reading a lot of cool battles, which are well written and entertaining, there's really nothing wrong with this book. You can hardly go wrong with it. It's not a huge investment, but as the sort of starter of the setting, it's a worthy entry.